Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents How to Be a Badass Detective 2 by Michael Anderle, narrated by Dara Rosenberg. Chapter 1. Mother LeBlanc laid a hand on James's forehead, which was warm. He was developing a fever as a side effect of his injuries, their long and harsh journey, and their lack of access to proper medical care. He needed bed rest, away from the elements. But he was alive, and they had, at last, found shelter. Samantha came up. Her brow was furrowed in concern, and she was haggard. She was nothing like her usual vivacious, flirtatious self. Her long hair was disheveled, and she had barely done anything to put it back in order. "How is he?" she asked. "Once we get him inside, I'm sure his chances will improve." LeBlanc nodded to acknowledge her, though she kept her eyes on James. "He's getting sick, but his injuries are better. If we can remain hidden at this place of yours for a solid week or more, I imagine he will make a full recovery." Befitting the age in which she had been born, long, long ago, LeBlanc had a formal and archaic way of speaking, and her voice was still tinged with a New Orleans Creole accent. The dark look in Samantha's eyes suggested she was not optimistic. After the loss of Damien and Zachariah, she had grown more protective of James than ever. "Let's go in, then. If the neighbors see us and ask too many questions, we can always erase their memories later." She gestured at the house. The 11 of them had detoured west to a rural area in north-central Pennsylvania, where they had buried Zachariah in the woods. Heading east again to Wilkes-Barre, where Samantha had a second house that no one seemed to know about, was a risk. But it was one they had to take, for James' sake, if nothing else. Josiah Kane pointed out, "There are no visible neighbors anyway. I'm assuming the privacy of this place is part of why it's your second home. There is no one around to see while you work out on your treadmill at night in a sports bra and hot pants in front of an open window with a strong backlight on." He'd said it with a teasing undercurrent of dry humor, and Samantha, despite herself, smiled. "I hadn't thought of it that way, but you're right. This place is dull." Mary Mitchell stepped forward to pick up one end of the makeshift stretcher on which James lay. "Dull is exactly what we need right now, I'm afraid. We've all had more than our fill of excitement. Shall we?" LeBlanc and Mitchell picked James up and carried him across the lawn, which was surrounded by high walls covered with ivy. Tall maple and oak trees provided further cover from the sight of the surrounding neighborhood with their reddening leaves. Samantha went to the front doors and unlocked them with a small brass key. Azudo, their new recruit, and therefore the only person present who was not a member of the North American Council of Thaumaturges, walked alongside the stretcher, glancing between the slumped and groaning form of James and the place that would hopefully provide him with a safe haven. The house was not palatial, falling 1,000 or 2 square feet short of what would qualify as a mansion, but it was far from small, with 2 stories and at least 3, perhaps 4 bedrooms. The magic users might be cramped, but they would manage. Azudo asked, "What kind of heating do you have here?" "James will need to keep warm." Though he had lived in Europe for years before coming to America, he was originally from Nigeria, where winter did not exist. The threat of cold weather was something he'd learned to take seriously. Samantha began. "I don't recall, actually, but we'll figure it out in a moment. If there are any problems, I'm sure we of all people can manage." Azudo nodded. Despite all he had seen lately, it was easy to forget just how powerful the council members were, although, compared to the Orthodoxy, perhaps not powerful enough. They brought James in through the small foyer, then, under Samantha's direction, carried him to the guest bedroom on the ground floor. The house had a musty but not unpleasant fragrance, as homes that had long sat disused often did. They could also use a good dusting. Azudo and Rufus Mayer helped LeBlanc and Mary pick James up slowly and carefully from the stretcher and lay him on the bed. LeBlanc pulled the covers over him, being cautious not to aggravate his chest wounds. He had taken 3 molten spears to the chest. If 1 or 2 minor factors had been different, if the injury had been infinitesimally worse, he would have been dead by now. James's eyes twitched and then opened, and he let out a long moan. "Where am I?" he asked in a hoarse voice. "Did everyone make it?" LeBlanc, standing over him, wondered how much of his memory remained intact. He had regained consciousness long enough to speak at Zacharia's makeshift funeral, but he might have forgotten about it. There was no point in being delicate. "Everyone is here except Zacharia and Damien. We are at Samantha's home away from home in Pennsylvania." James looked sad. "Yeah, I remember about Zacharia now. God damn it. I'm sorry I brought it up." He lifted a hand and rubbed his eyes. "And Pennsylvania isn't far enough. Ideally, we should be in, like, Oklahoma or something by now. Did they destroy my house, by the way?" Amanda Moore moved closer to the bed. "We performed a scrying spell last night to check on the Orthodoxy's movements. We didn't dare look too closely so they couldn't trace the spell back to our location, so we only saw your house from afar. Bird's eye view, about a quarter mile to the west." Mary added, "It seems they have chosen to occupy your estate for the time being, perhaps to raid it for valuables and rest and gather their strength. Thus far, they do not seem to be in a great hurry to hunt us down. Humiliating us by driving us out of New York appears to have sufficed for the time being. They will undoubtedly come back to finish what they started, and soon, but we should have time for you to recover." James blinked. "You're all taking a massive risk for my sake, you realize? I appreciate it, but don't all get killed just because of me. Where are my glasses?" Hugh Buchanan smiled. "We have no intention of being wiped out." Twisting around and fishing inside her blouse, Samantha produced a case about the length of a hand and opened it. "Here you are, James." She produced his glasses, unfolded them, and handed them over. He slipped them on. "All right. I remember this place. We were here for a week, at one time. Fun stuff." Samantha blushed, but leaned closer to him and squeezed his hand. LeBlanc cleared her throat. "James needs his rest. Let's gather in the living room to talk, and when there's time, perhaps we can have tea or coffee." As the majority of them strolled out of the guest room, LeBlanc sidled up to Azudo and said in a low voice, "Samantha and James were once in a relationship, which is not unusual, since Samantha has had many relationships. They really speak on it for various reasons that are none of our business, but you ought to know. She is taking his injury harder than I'd expected." Azudo rubbed his hands. The sun was setting and it was growing cold. "That makes sense. I am closer to him and you than the others, though I am becoming fond of all of you. What has been happening is not something I wish to see any more of." "None of us do," LeBlanc agreed. "You are taking it better than we are. Your work for charitable organizations in trouble spots around the globe has probably hardened you, at least somewhat, to violence and tragedy. It has been a long time since we of the Council have seen anything like this happen, particularly in our own home territory. Not so long ago, we were concerned with day-to-day matters and how best to run our organization. Now we are fleeing and fighting for our lives." She shook her head, and her dark eyes looked somewhere beyond the broad living room window. Although Azudo had been born with the gift of magic and had taught himself to use it in certain basic ways, it was only since he'd come to America with LeBlanc and James that he had begun to receive formal training. He was advancing rapidly, but there was still much work to be done. Still, despite his limited experience, he had been developing one of the secondary abilities that came with the full unlocking of one's thaumaturgic potential, enhanced perception of the emotional vibe given off by others, including those who were good at hiding their feelings. Though they were trying to be stoic, every one of the council members, including the normally even-keeled LeBlanc, was on the verge of being overwhelmed by grief and fear. He wondered how long the council had reigned supreme and unchallenged in America. How long it had been since not just one but two of their members had been killed in a battle, and half the rest wounded, with all the survivors hounded and scattered from their places of authority. Samantha remained in the room with James for a moment, but called to them that there was probably old tea and cups in the kitchen. LeBlanc went off to do the brewing, while the others settled in the living room. Those still nursing wounds took to the couches and armchairs, while the rest leaned against the walls or brought in wooden chairs from the dining room. Crystal Green, who was one of the better healers amongst them, though none of them were specialists, announced to the rest, "As LeBlanc mentioned, James will require at least a week to recover, and that is if we do our part by helping him along with restorative magic, as well as mundane medicine. Samantha tells me, though, that she has almost no emotional ties to this place, which will make it harder for the Orthodoxy to track us here. And there are no records of its existence in James's library." Lauren Jones commented, "Well, that's good. But James mentioned the time he and Samantha spent here, and it seemed to affect her. We'll have to cleanse the emotive vibe that may have created." "Good point," Mary agreed. "We will do so tonight before we sleep." LeBlanc returned with a tray and a dozen small porcelain cups, from which steam rose. "I'll be back with the second round. Help yourselves." She set the cups on the coffee table and went to gather the remainder. "There. I think we could all use this. It's a small comfort, but an excellent one, I'd say." No one disagreed. Samantha emerged and took one of the cups into the guest room for James before coming out and joining the others for the discussion. Azuto sat and listened, contributing little. To some extent, they regarded him as comparable to a younger brother tagging along with the older boys. His presence was tolerated, but he was not truly one of them. Not yet, anyway. Still, they seemed to respect him. He had done as they'd asked during the awful battle at James's mansion, helping them all without quailing when the fight turned against them. His intervention had helped save James from dying on the scene. No one was in agreement as to what their next course of action ought to be. Everyone was still recovering mentally, physically, and emotionally from their defeat. "So," Amanda persisted, "when do we counterattack? If we move quickly, we might be able to strike them before they've prepared for their next maneuver. We could eliminate them, or at least do heavy damage, while they're still complacent and overconfident." Since Ikaria had passed away, Amanda had become unusually strident, almost vicious. LeBlanc, Lauren, Mary, and Rufus exchanged glances. Hugh Buchanan sat impassively, and the others frowned. LeBlanc took the initiative. "I do not think," she began carefully, "that it would be wise to launch a counteroffensive at the time. We were not able to pick off as many of their troops as we'd like, and they still outnumber us by a large margin. What might be better is to rally the minor covens or lull the Orthodoxy into greater complacency by spreading the rumor that we fled the country and are languishing in exile on another continent." "Perhaps," Rufus said. "We certainly do not want the minor covens to swear allegiance to our enemies. They would be able to provide the Orthodoxy with substantial information about our movements and assets, or might even find themselves conscripted in the war against us." Josiah Kane grimaced. "They already made it perfectly clear that they wish to stay out of this. Perhaps when they see how brutal the Orthodoxy truly is, they will change their minds, albeit too late for our friends." LeBlanc added, "It is possible that some of them will offer tacit aid, if not explicit. But for the most part, we might be on our own for the time being. The Orthodoxy is stronger than we expected. Almost too strong. It is not over yet, but we need to recover." Watching them, Azuto was more certain than ever how dire the circumstances were. As Mother LeBlanc had said, there was always hope. But even for her, hope seemed slim indeed. Milena unfolded her razor blade. Traditionally, the procedure called for a ceremonial knife. For novice practitioners, it helped them extract the maximum amount of energy from their subjects. But Milena had been doing this long enough that any blade would suffice for her purposes. The sharper, the better. The man on the table moaned through the rag stuffed in his mouth, which had been secured with tape wound around his face. He was also blindfolded, and his arms and legs were strapped down at the wrists and ankles. Milena turned her head toward him. "Be silent, please. There is no point in trying to speak. Nothing you could say would have any effect on what is to come. And it will be over quickly. You will not suffer more than is necessary. I am a professional." She looked at the razor again, then ran its blade quickly through the flame of a black candle and washed it with pure water from a silver pitcher. The spell worked best when there were few, if any, contaminants interfering with the mingling of steel and blood. Not many witches still practiced the form of magic in which Milena had chosen to specialize. She was among the last true experts, which was part of what made her so valuable to the Orthodoxy. Within the last 9 years, she had finally secured a seat on the highest council. Though the youngest and newest member of the elite, she was officially the equal of those who ranked just below Grand Mistress Inezga. She held the razor by her side and used her free hand to open the little black book on the stand to the appropriate page. The tomb was bound in jet-colored steer hide, and its writings and etchings were a curious dark, rusty brown color. The passage to which she had turned described an ancient spell, dark, potent, and long forbidden in polite magical society. It was the type of witchcraft that instilled fear in the common populace, and had in the dim past led the human authorities, religious and secular, to pursue long campaigns of persecution against the arcane and thaumaturgic arts. But it was useful, and since the Orthodoxy had pledged to protect all witches from harassment by the normal majority, Milena had no fear of retribution. Her secrets would be safe as long as the Coven's victories continued, which they would, thanks in part to what she was about to do tonight. Milena turned around and looked at the man. He was naked and covered with sweat, which was a product of his fear since the room was chilly. He was an average-looking man in early middle age, perhaps 40, with dark hair and brown eyes. Tension went through his body as he pulled against the straps, writhing and struggling in vain. Milena's red lips parted in a smile. "Calm yourself," she said. "Again, it will be over soon. You will feel very little of this." The table was made of stone, with slots beneath its surface that were originally intended for thick rope or chains. In the modern age, tough elastic straps worked better still. There were also smooth indentations or channels carved into it that directed the subject's blood away from his body so it could be put to good use. Certainly, the man was not doing anything remarkable with his life. He was a standard expendable person with a slight sensitivity to magic, but not enough for him to have become a warlock of any degree of accomplishment. Still, his faint trace of the gift meant his blood would add more power to the spell than if he had been a thoroughly mundane specimen. His whimpering and thrashing grew more frenetic as she approached. "Think of it this way," she explained in a soft, soothing voice. "Your vitality will bring life, strength, and success to others. You are contributing to something greater than yourself, a world in which magic is safe." She cast a light charm of calming on him. It was important that he remain conscious for the sacrifice to have its full effect, so the spell only relaxed him enough to where he ceased trying to escape and accepted his fate. Then Milena raised her hands and spoke the incantation for the blood rite. Most of it was in languages so old, they bore no resemblance to the Indo-European roots of her native Russian, coming as they did from dark prehistory when magic was both stronger and more fearsome. Finally, she bent over the victim, the razor in her hand, and completed the work. The man's death was messy and painful, but relatively quick. Such was the witch's expertise that he passed out from severe blood loss within a matter of seconds, and his body died a few seconds later. The only part of him that retained any life force was the warm red fluid. His blood flowed down through the channels and into the small obsidian fountain that lay beside the altar table. Given how much denser and stickier blood is compared to water, it did not flow as freely, so maintaining the fountain was a full-time job. Each day, Milena had to rejuvenate the heating spell that kept the volcanic stone nice and warm to thin the blood, and keep it pumping through the fountain's channels to spill out the mouth of the squat, leering gargoyle perched atop the rock formation. From there, it ran down into the basin, gurgling, before being cycled back through. The hydraulic function of it was simple. The magical function was more complex, though, and when it was in operation, the fountain glowed faintly with a mixture of deep reds and bright greens. Each member of the Orthodoxy, before their commencement of hostilities with the North American Council of Thaumaturgy, had added a drop of their blood to the fountain, leaving it there to be mingled with the fresh infusions from various sacrificial victims. And thus was the bond of power maintained. The fountain sent charges of power to the contributing witches, increasing their strength by a factor of at least 30%, closer to 50 in some cases. It also granted them easier access to certain types of magic that most covens had deliberately obscured behind the veil of time and ignorance. Milena herself was among those who received the benefits, though she had not participated in the fighting thus far. Her role was one of support, and she performed it well. Sighing as the newest boost in power began to take effect, making her feel warm and energized, she turned away from the pale, unmoving corpse and went back to the stand where the book lay to clean her razor blade and contemplate the tasks to come. The fountain required the blood of one full-sized human to replenish itself approximately once every 5 days. Those with a tinge of magic were better, but normal people would usually suffice. Milena would have to begin the search for another subject within the next 48 hours. It occurred to her that once the Orthodoxy had achieved total victory and held dominion over the continent, they would have access to the various local covens' records. That would make it far easier to track down persons who would make good sacrifices should the fountain become necessary once more to put down petty rebellions or defend their new territory from challengers. There's always the need for war, it seems, she reflected. But such is the way of things. And I am a professional. Chapter 2. Chris stared in wonder at the package on the counter. You know, I had only heard about maple sugar candy, like once or twice. Thought it was a Canadian thing. Kera shrugged. Vermont is close enough to Canada, and it's not like there's a shortage of maples. It's technically not the season for it, but they sell it year-round. As the counterman rang up the sale, Chris nodded at the obvious insight. Touché. In fact, now that you mention it, I don't think I've ever been this far north. I half expected it to be nothing but a frozen wasteland that belongs on a Scandinavian metal album cover. Kera pointed out, if we stay long enough, it will look that way, but it's a couple months off yet. Of course, I have no intention whatsoever of remaining in my mom's clutches for that long. The guy running the shop, a big friendly-faced balding man, looked at them. You're from around New York, aren't you? Winter up here sometimes sets in a month earlier than it does down there. Kera smiled and shrugged. Technically Connecticut, but if Vermont can be close enough to Canada, I guess Connecticut can be close enough to New York. Plus, my parents have a townhouse there. In the city, I mean. Oh, nice, he replied, accepting the money. Well, you came at the right time. Lots of folks from the cities down south head up here for the leaves. Chris quipped. Way down south. We live in L.A., though she's from the Northeast originally. Oh. The man handed them the candy. Bet you're already missing the weather back there. I've been thinking about retiring to California when the time comes. Kera laughed. The climate is nice, to be sure. Not sure I'd consider L.A. a good retirement spot, but it's not like it's the only place in the state. There are much quieter towns if you look around for them. They said goodbye and headed outside to the family car they'd taken, a silver Prius, where Kira's mother would be meeting them any minute now. Kera exhaled. Her tension and aggravation must have been obvious. It was absurd, she knew, since she, Chris, and Mom had been getting along surprisingly well. Nothing too terrible or embarrassing had occurred. So far, anyway. Kira's father had been present most of the time, and he tended to impose a degree of sanity on the proceedings. However, he'd sat out the trip up to Vermont, so Kera feared it was only a matter of time before Mrs. MacDonagh dropped the hammer and demanded detailed reports on every single aspect of Kira's and Chris's existence. Man, Chris exhaled, looking at the scenery. It's weird seeing so many trees. Everywhere you look, if there aren't buildings, it's just trees, trees, and more trees. I guess I've been in SoCal too long. Makes me a little claustrophobic, even though it's pretty. He slipped a hand around Kira's waist, and she joined him in enjoying the moment while they waited. Yeah, that makes sense. We used to come up to random places in the rustic parts of New England every autumn, so I'm used to it, though it's been a while. Makes me more nostalgic than anything. Chris nodded. My parents went up to Oregon sometimes. Slightly different type of forest, but still tons of greenery. It's been a long time since I've seen the place, though. Oh, which route are we taking back to Danbury tomorrow? Same one? Kera replied. Let's not. I'd rather see different stuff each way. Plus, we took the longer route on our way up, and I think everyone would rather get home a little quicker. After securing their reservation at a hotel in Rutland in south-central Vermont, they had driven up via I-84 east through half of Connecticut before switching onto I-91 in Hartford and following it the rest of the way north through Massachusetts and then along the state line between Vermont and New Hampshire. It had taken about 4 hours. Kera planned to take the more direct westerly route back, which would save them perhaps 15 minutes. Not much, but better than nothing. It involved taking US 7 south-southwest and then getting onto 22, which would lead them down through the easternmost part of New York State, before finally getting back on I-84 and returning to Danbury. After that, they would spend only one more night at home. She and Chris would board a plane for Los Angeles the following day. Chris pulled her close to him, and she obliged, resting her head against his shoulder. "So," she asked, "have you had a good time so far? Also, we should dig into that candy soon. Maybe not right now, but definitely soon." He moved it away from her as though he were protecting it. "Noted. And yes, I'm glad we did this. Your parents aren't so bad, really, and it's been nice and interesting seeing where you grew up and whatnot. The vibe is a lot different back here, aside from everything still being, well, American. Also, since we discussed the driving route back to Connecticut, I'm still trying to cope with the way everyone refers to highways as just I-69 or whatever they are. Like, I had no idea that the rest of the country didn't call them the I-69. Weird." Kera laughed. "Technically, Californians are the weird ones, but I guess everything's relative." And oh, hell, speaking of relative, Mrs. MacDonagh had appeared without warning at the far end of the lot, swinging a paper shopping bag by its loop handle and adjusting her unnecessarily large floppy hat and sunglasses. She looked like a New Yorker vacationing in Florida in the summer, though it was all of 65 degrees out. By LA standards, the weather was a touch on the cooler side. Chris waved as the woman approached. "Hi, Mom. We got some maple sugar candy." Kira's mother adjusted her glasses again. "Oh, did you? I suppose I shouldn't be surprised, given that Kera has always had a sweet tooth. She used to devour cookies on a daily basis. I suppose it's for the best that she was always active, or she might have gotten fat on us. Dear," she added, looking at Kera, "you are eating, aren't you? You're still young enough that your metabolism can excuse how thin you are, but I can't help worrying that you might have grown obsessed with your figure. You're not experimenting with anorexia or bulimia, are you?" Chris briefly struggled to keep a straight face, but after a second or two, he made a sputtering, snorting sound that turned into guffaws of laughter. Sighing, Kera said, "No, Mom, I eat a healthy diet and get plenty of nutrition. I'm naturally thin, I guess. Plus I get plenty of exercise. That's all." Getting himself back under control, Chris affirmed, "Plenty of nutrition. Yeah, that's one way of putting it. This girl can and does eat. Believe me." Mrs. MacDonagh was now only about 10 feet away. "Well, that's good then. Wait, that isn't a double entendre, is it? If it is, please don't admit it. The thought just popped into my head that it might be, and I'm afraid I said it out loud before I thought about the consequences." Kera put a hand over her eyes and allowed her face to droop toward the pavement. "No, Mom, I eat a lot of food to keep my energy up. High caloric needs due to my activity level, that's all." It was true, of course. In addition to needing to refuel because of her martial arts training and workouts, performing magic burned a ton of fat. Up close, Chris could see the resemblance between mother and daughter, notwithstanding Mrs. MacDonagh being half disguised by her hat and shades. Both were thin, on the taller side of average, and light-complected with fine features. The older woman's hair was blonde, as Kera's was, though Kera had begun dyeing her hair black shortly before they started dating. Kera's mother showed them her purchases. A nice little wood carving of a fish which she planned to keep on her mantel, and a framed photograph of the fall color, which she insisted Kera take back to L.A. "Oh, thanks," Kera responded. "You didn't have to get me anything, but I appreciate it." Mrs. MacDonagh smiled. "Don't mention it. Besides, it cost far less than the rest of this trip, and we can afford it." Good point, Kera thought, But formalities are formalities. I wonder how...
Sample complete. Ready to continue?